The baby had just stopped crying when the smoke hit her nose. It was faint at first, wood smoke, but not the good kind, not the sort that warms, the kind that consumes, the kind that moves like a devil through timber, wrapping up every memory, every beam and plank, and dragging it back to the dark. Annie Burkett didn't scream. She'd done her screaming months ago when the wagon rolled off the bluff with her husband and son still inside. Now she just clutched the baby, hers and hers alone now, and moved fast, boots dragging in half-frozen mud, heart pounding. Outside, the fire was already crawling across the porch roof, orange tongues licking up dry pine bark her husband had so proudly carved himself last May. The smoke curled thick from the eaves, black and hungry, and a ring of settlers stood in the field beyond it, lit by the early blue haze of morning and the infernal flickering behind them. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. "You curse this land," one man had told her weeks ago, when a calf was born dead near the creek and the winter squalls came early. "You should have left after your man died. Bad things grow where a widow stays too long alone." She had laughed back then. She didn't now. She turned and ran, not back into the woods, where she might be tracked like a stray, not into town, where every door had closed when she begged for a single lantern to keep the frost off her infant's breath. No, she ran toward the ravine. That was the only place left untouched. No one ventured that way. The stone cliffs were slick with moss, and a deep crack at the base hissed warm air even in the dead of snow. Folks called it bad ground, said strange things lived beneath, that animals wouldn't go near it. She had once thought it nonsense. Now, with her cabin burning behind her, her only child pressed silent against her chest, and the sound of boot heels crunching toward her in the cold dirt, Annie didn't care if the ground whispered or screamed. She dropped down the ravine like it was a stairway to grace, and it was warm, not enough to strip her shawl, but enough to sting her cheeks with sudden wetness. Steam curling around lichen-covered rocks, snow melted into dark puddles beneath her boots. No wind down here, no eyes, only the deep hush of earth hiding something ancient. She set the baby down gently on a nest of dry moss and wept, not from fear or grief or rage, though all those lived inside her like thorns now. She wept because she could finally stop running, for now. But warmth was not survival. The snow would deepen. The settlers wouldn't stop. This hollow, this breathing place in the earth, it had given her refuge, not safety. She wiped her face, stared into the crack where the warm air rose. Deeper inside, she saw what looked like layered shelves of rock, jagged and uneven but dry. The ceiling bent low, forcing her to duck as she explored, stepping over twisted roots, animal bones, a pile of old, half-rotted timber that looked like someone else had tried and failed to shelter here before. That didn't matter. She would not fail. Annie was not building a shelter. She was building something unkillable. For the next 3 days, she moved like a ghost through the woods by moonlight, taking what others had left behind. Stones from the old quarry trail, broken logs from an abandoned trapping line, canvas from a torn wagon cover half buried in snow. She gathered clay from a dry creek bed and carried it in sacks made from her dead husband's shirts. Each night she returned to the ravine and dug deeper, working by lantern light with hands that no longer bled because they had already lost too much. The steam from the vent curled constantly, steady even, like breath. She tested the soil, dry near the vent, moist near the base, perfect. She built the floor from riverstone and clay-packed logs, fitted tight to trap the rising warmth. Walls came next, sloped, low, supported by angled timbers packed with moss and frozen dirt. She shaped them, not tall, but thick, letting them blend into the ground, like the shelter wasn't built atop the land, but drawn up from it. Above the vent, she placed her stove, the only thing she had left from the old cabin, dragged out from the ashes in secret by moonlight after the settlers left. It had cracked in the fall, but she patched it with clay, reinforced it with rock, and fed it gently. The vent's warmth kept the pipe from freezing. The air inside stayed dry. The fire burned slow. Inside the shelter, the baby slept. Outside, the freeze came. The settlers called it the sudden snap. Temperatures dropped faster than anyone could remember. By the second week of December, 3 cabins collapsed under snow weight. One man lost his hand to frostbite, and a mother and child were found frozen in an outhouse barely 10 feet from their front porch. But the ravine stayed warm. Annie stayed silent. One night, she watched the glow of another settler's home flicker out entirely. She'd heard the crying first, the sharp wail of a baby, the thud of boots, a woman's voice shouting something desperate into the void of the white night. She stood, opened the clay-packed door of her shelter, let the warm air escape just enough to guide them in. When they reached the ravine, the woman was barely holding upright, her child, blue-lipped and limp in her arms. Behind her, 2 men followed, one she recognized as the same who had spat on her doorstep last spring. She let them in anyway. They slept through the worst of the cold. By morning, the child stirred. The woman wept. The man did not speak, not then. But the next night, when another storm hit, 3 more settlers came, then 5, then 10. By the end of the week, there were over a dozen crammed into the earth shelter Annie had made, each one of them silent, ashamed, and warm. Not one dared look her in the eye, not one thanked her, but they all stayed. And when she passed through their sleeping bodies to tend the fire, they parted for her like the tide pulling back from a shoreline too steady to drown. One man, the same who had watched her cabin burn, stood watch near the entrance. He did not speak, but he did not stop her. She heard him weep once, very softly, when he thought no one would hear. She said nothing, because she had built something now that they couldn't take away, not by fire, not by frost, not even by silence. And she knew the freeze hadn't reached its worst yet. The worst was still coming. The freeze deepened like a hand tightening around the valley. It wasn't the kind of cold you could see on glass or feel on skin. It was a cold that got inside you, settled in your joints, stiffened your breath, made your heart beat slower. Horses froze where they stood. Wells cracked at their rims. People started whispering about things again, signs and curses and why it was colder this year than any they remembered. But no one dared speak Annie's name anymore. They just crept, night after night, through the birchwood and down the ravine where the air still rose warm from the earth's hidden breath. Annie kept the door braced from within, low, layered with a patchwork of bark, canvas, and frozen moss packed tight between poles. She didn't lock anyone out, but she didn't invite them in either. If they made it through the dark, if they brought their children wrapped tight and held their shame like blankets on their backs, she let them pass. No words, no vengeance, only survival. By mid-January, there were 23 souls crammed inside her earthen shelter. The first night she saw frost on the ceiling, she didn't panic. She stoked the stove, quietly, methodically, and walked the perimeter of the shelter, checking for drafts. The walls, packed with layers of earth and cloth and rock, held tight. Only the seams around the stovepipe were sweating. Too much moisture from too many bodies. She tore open her only spare skirt and stuffed the gaps with thick wool strips. Then she set the children to work, taught them how to press clay into the cracks and where to poke vents to keep air moving just enough. The silence of the adults unnerved her more than the wind outside. Most of them hadn't spoken to her since arriving. They murmured among themselves, ate in quiet pairs, and nodded to her when she passed, but their eyes always dropped fast. They still saw her as a widow, as a curse, as something that should have stayed buried with the cabin they burned. But their children did not. A little girl, with 2 missing fingers and a half-frozen doll, followed Annie everywhere. A boy, barely old enough to walk, brought her twigs and rabbit bones, thinking them treasures. A baby nursed beside hers, too young to understand the world's cruelty, but warm now, alive. And so she worked. The shelter could not be improved upward. Height lost heat, but it could be widened. Annie chose the far side wall and began digging with a flat rock, wrist wrapped in rags to keep it from blistering again. The soil came out damp but not frozen. Good sign. She taught 2 older boys how to haul it out in bark-wrapped sleds, dumping it quietly outside, where it blended into snowbanks by dawn. Each night she gained another 2 feet, more room for bodies, more room to breathe. But it wasn't just space they needed. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It crept in other ways. A man coughed for 3 days straight before the child beside him started coughing too. Then another. Annie moved fast. She shifted those sick to one end of the shelter, reinforced a second layer of clay wall around them, poked a vent pipe through with a broken rifle barrel, and burned extra fuel just for them. She didn't sleep for 3 days, sat up with damp cloths pressed to the children's foreheads, whispering songs her mother used to sing, songs she'd sworn she'd never sing again after burying her husband and boy. But some songs keep people breathing, so she sang. On the 4th night, the coughing stopped, and on the 5th, the man whose child had nearly died finally spoke. "I was the one," he said, voice barely above a rasp. "I lit the match on your roof that night." She didn't answer, just stared at him. "I thought you were wrong," he said. "The way you stayed after your man died, the way nothing grew near your land, the way folks looked at you. I thought if your cabin was gone, the bad luck would go with it." He waited, maybe for her to yell, maybe for her to strike him. She didn't. He bowed his head. I'll dig. I'll do whatever you need. Just Let me stay. Let my boy stay. Annie turned, pointed to the unfinished corner of the new wall. You'll start there, she said. That was all. He worked harder than the rest after that, moved in silence, but never hid his face. When others grew tired, he worked longer. When food ran low, he gave his portion to his son. He never asked forgiveness again, just kept building. By early February, the shelter was nearly double in size. The stove burned low but steady, fed by scavenged roots and resin-heavy pine knots found deep in the woods. Annie taught the older women how to mix bark flour into soup, how to strain pine needles into tea, how to store warmth in rocks buried by the stove, and moved around the shelter at night. She slept sitting up, her baby in her arms, never more than 2 hours at a time, and she dreamed of fire, not the kind that warms, the kind that devours. She woke one night choking on smoke. It wasn't the stove. One of the settlers, hungry, angry, maybe sick in the mind, had tried to light a second fire near the back of the shelter, thinking it would heat faster, better. He'd used too much pitch. The flame caught dry moss, and smoke rolled fast before anyone saw. She tackled him, dragged him bodily outside into the freeze, shoved him down the slope, and stood between him and the shelter with her shoulders squared and her teeth clenched so hard they ached. "You bring fire to my roof again," she said, her voice cold as the wind that cut between them, "and you'll freeze under it, alone." He didn't argue. He fled. Inside, the children had woken. Some cried. Others trembled. Annie moved through them like a storm in reverse, quieting, calming, touching shoulders, whispering steady words. The fire hadn't spread. The smoke was venting. The danger passed. But the fear stayed. It clung to the walls like soot. That night, the man who'd lit her cabin came to her again, this time with a gift, a locket, silver, burnished. Inside, a portrait, her old cabin, sketched by hand, before the fire. "My wife drew it," he said. "She died in the last freeze. I didn't want to forget the warmth." Annie stared at the locket a long time. Then she took it, not as forgiveness, as memory. Later, as she rocked her baby to sleep, she tucked the locket into a crevice above the stove, where the steam would polish it each night, where it would not be lost. February burned on, and so did they. In early March, the first thaw came. Not real spring, not yet, but a softening, a dripping edge to icicles, a sound in the distance like the world exhaling after too long holding breath. People began to talk again, not just whispers, real voices, laughter even. A little girl played a game where she pretended the stove was a queen, and everyone had to bring her gifts of pine cones and hot rocks. The baby next to Annie's took her first steps. The coughs lessened, spirits lifted, but Annie didn't relax, because thaw meant melt, and melt meant wet, and wet meant collapse. So she doubled the roof beams. She stripped the old broken canvas, replaced it with bark and clay, angled everything for drainage, and dug side channels out into the snow. She reinforced the base with stone, cut runoff ditches around the perimeter, and packed the inside with gravel scavenged from the creek. Every hour of warmth she treated like borrowed time. The others watched her, helped her, learned from her. Somewhere in the middle of that month, they stopped calling it Annie's shelter. They just called it shelter. But she hadn't forgotten the first night, the burning porch, the silent ring of settlers. She hadn't forgotten the weight of smoke in her lungs, or the silence in her baby's body as they ran. She never would. And even as they talked about rebuilding, about returning to their homesteads, about next winter, Annie knew she would not return. She was not part of their town. She never would be. She would stay in the ravine, with the warmth that rose from the deep, with the child who never cried anymore, who slept soundly against her chest. And when the last storm came, and it would come, she knew she would be ready, because she was no longer the widow they whispered about. She was the one they followed. The final storm began like a trick. That morning the sky broke open. A sun too bright for March glinted off the ravine walls, and birds, actual birds, circled above the trees, as if spring had returned with a vengeance. The shelter's chimney puffed a soft white coil into blue air, and for the first time in over 2 months, a few of the children played just outside the mouth of the cave, boot soles crunching lightly on thawing ground, muffled by wet snow that no longer bit at the skin. A woman sang near the stove as she stirred something that could almost be called soup. A man sharpened an axe that hadn't been used since Christmas. Laughter echoed, real laughter, and Annie, still half awake, leaned against the stone wall with her baby pressed to her chest and felt something tight loosen inside her for the first time in weeks. That feeling was gone by noon. It began with the light. The bright, soft yellow of morning turned grayish, then silver, then dim. The air pressed heavier with each breath, like the clouds were crouching lower, inch by inch. Winds came next, slow at first, curious rather than angry, nudging branches and lifting corners of tarps. Then came the quiet, the kind that freezes even the crows in their trees. Annie stood in the ravine's mouth, staring upward, and felt it coming before the others did. She didn't yell. She turned, stepped back into the shelter, shut the entrance tight, secured it with 3 fresh poles. Then she calmly told the mothers to pull the children back, told the men to gather every scrap of food, fabric, wood, and fuel into one pile near the center wall. And then, only then, did she speak loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's coming," she said. The laughter stopped. Some of them began moving faster. Others just stared. A boy started to ask a question, but his voice faded when he saw Annie's face. They remembered what she had looked like the night her home burned, and she looked just the same now. By late afternoon, the snow was falling straight down, thick and solid. No flakes, no powder, just a wall of white descending like the breath of God had frozen mid-air and was falling in sheets. By sundown, the ravine above was silent, and then the wind came. Not like before, not like anything they'd survived. It came like a force trying to uproot the world. The whole slope trembled. The vents in the shelter groaned. The door bulged inward like something monstrous was breathing against it. Dust rained down from the cracks in the ceiling. Annie didn't panic. She moved to the stove, stoked it again, checked the heat stones. She checked the drainage ditches, found one blocked, and cleared it with her bare hands. Then she sat by the door, shoulders braced against the beam, and told everyone to sleep. No one did. That first night, they could hear trees snapping. Not branches, whole trunks. Like the forest itself was being broken. Something thudded above. Maybe a boulder loosened by ice. But it didn't pierce the roof. Another hour passed, then another. The baby whimpered. One of the older men whispered a prayer. At some point in the dead hours before dawn, the snow came down so fast that it packed the ravine to the brim. The shelter's chimney, only just barely poking above the surface, got clogged. The smoke backed up. Annie was already moving. She tore a seam in the secondary vent pipe, let the smoke leak into the back corner instead, and shoved 2 boys up the sloped air shaft she'd dug weeks ago, the one everyone thought was just for runoff. She told them to climb fast, find the surface, and dig the chimney clear. They did. When they came back, faces pale and eyes wide, they said the snow was chest deep in March. By the second day, the last food ran out. What little remained, a bundle of dried turnip root, a handful of acorns, bark flour. They ground and boiled and strained into a thin broth that tasted like ash, but it kept the youngest children from crying. Annie rationed her own food silently, slipping her portion to a girl who hadn't spoken since her brother died 2 weeks before. Then came the second collapse. A section of the eastern wall sagged, clay cracking in long, wet seams. The heat was melting the outer layer, weakening the base. The storm above was pressing down so hard that the roof itself groaned. Annie didn't sleep that night. She pressed her palm to the wall and waited. When she felt the faintest give, she shouted. 3 men helped her brace it. Logs jammed into the clay, ropes slung tight, stones piled as counterweight. They reinforced the ceiling too, doubling the main beams, wrapping them with frost-stiff canvas. When it held, some people cried, but Annie didn't, because she knew this was not the worst. The third night, a woman went into labor. No warning, just a scream, then another, and suddenly the tight calm of the shelter became chaos. Annie cleared a corner, set fresh cloth beneath the woman, set hot stones in a circle for warmth, boiled water, and called over the only other woman with birthing experience. They worked for hours, between wind howls and door bracing and more smoke control, until the cry came. A child, alive, a miracle. Some said it out loud, others only stared, wide-eyed and shaken, like they had seen something too holy for words. Annie didn't speak. She just wrapped the baby, helped the mother drink, and returned to her post by the door, because now came the final test. The morning after the birth, the wind stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Everything muffled, heavy, no bird, no groan of tree, just blankness. The ravine above was buried. The chimney had vanished again. There was no way out. One man began muttering. "Buried alive," he said. "We're buried alive." Others joined. Fear is a fast thing in closed rooms. Annie stood slowly, faced them. "We are not dead," she said. "We are warm. We are fed. We are together." But the man kept speaking. He reached for a shovel. "I'll dig us out. I can't breathe in here. I can't breathe." He lunged for the back wall, and the wall gave way. Snow exploded inward. A blast of cold like a blade sliced through the shelter, toppling a lantern and plunging the space into semi-darkness. Annie shouted, shoved the man aside, grabbed a timber from the pile, and jammed it across the breach. Others helped, hands flying without words, stuffing cloth, packing snow, sealing it again. They made it hold, but barely. Annie turned to the man. "You'll wait," she said. "You'll dig when I say." He didn't argue. For the next 2 days, They sat in low light, burning only when necessary. Annie set shifts, 2 people at a time tending the fire, 2 guarding the vents, 2 resting, 2 watching the new mother and child. She stayed awake more than anyone. She barely spoke. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, but her eyes never stopped moving. She was calculating everything: heat, air, time. On the 4th morning, the smoke stopped again. No one waited this time. 2 boys had already volunteered. They crawled into the shaft, found the top, dug. When they broke through, they shouted down, "Sky! Blue! It's blue!" People cheered, but Annie only exhaled. She stepped outside that afternoon, blinking into a sun so bright it burned. The ravine was a white bowl. Trees, stripped of bark, leaned like dying men. Her chimney, once lost, now jutted proud from a mound of wind-packed snow. And the shelter, her shelter, had held. It had not buckled, not broken, not caved. They had survived. One by one, they stepped out behind her, squinting, silent. A few knelt to touch the snow. Others wept openly. The woman who had given birth clutched her newborn and looked at Annie like she was seeing something unearthly. "You saved us," she whispered, but Annie shook her head. "I built a place," she said. "You saved yourselves." Later, as they stood in a loose ring around the vent chimney, a man stepped forward, the same one who had burned her home. His face was gaunt, weathered, ashen with guilt. He held out a bundle. It was her cabin's old door latch, twisted, blackened by fire, but still whole. "I dug it out," he said. "It's all that's left." She took it, turned it over in her hand, held it for a moment, then walked back toward the shelter. With bare hands, she jammed the latch into the clay above the doorway, left it there, not as a trophy, as proof. Proof that they had come through fire and built something that even winter could not erase. The shelter stood even as the snow began to melt away around it, while roofs across the valley sagged with rot and broken chimneys marked the places where men had once hammered dreams into timber. Annie's hollow in the ravine dried slow and steady. No water seeped in, no mold took hold. The walls, darkened by months of breathing human air, stayed tight-packed, hardened now with heat and time, as if the shelter itself had grown bones beneath the clay. But not everyone stayed. Some settlers, those with surviving land or livestock, left within the week. They offered her things when they went: a sack of beans, a rusted kettle, an extra pair of boots. Not one of them called her cursed anymore. Some of them bowed their heads when they passed. 1 or 2 knelt. Annie accepted their gifts, not out of pride or forgiveness, but because she had mouths to feed now, and the mountain didn't care what names they called her before. By the end of March, only 9 souls remained in the shelter, including Annie and her child. The others had scattered back to their burned cabins, fractured farms, or whatever shreds of life they thought they could gather back together from the freeze. But none of them rebuilt near her. They gave her the ravine, as if she owned it now, as if they feared it belonged to her in a way no one could take back. She didn't ask them to stay away. She didn't ask for anything. She just kept building. Spring was a mean thing that year, wet, cold at night, and so slow in its coming that trees didn't bud until well into April. The air stayed sharp. Winds still sang through the bones of the forest. Deer kept to higher ground. Traps came up empty. Food was tight. Not desperate, not yet, but close. The man who had burned her cabin offered to take 2 boys with him into the higher ridges to hunt. He was different now, quieter, thinner, but steady in the way men get after surviving something too big for words. She nodded once, gave them bark cloth to wrap the meat if they found any, and turned back to digging a new vent tunnel before they even left. She didn't pray for them. She just expected them to come back. And they did. 3 days later, dragging the body of a yearling elk between them. Their faces were cracked red from wind, one of the boys limping, but all alive. The meat lasted weeks. She salted what she could, buried slabs in the coldest corners of the ravine, fed the babies first, then the old man with the broken hand, then herself. Still, it wasn't the food that changed things. It was the way people began to listen. They asked her how she knew to pack the floor with gravel, how she figured the slope of the vents, how she could tell the roof was softening before anyone else noticed, how she made a fire burn hot enough to warm 10 people without blackening the ceiling. She didn't answer with theory. She didn't give lessons. She just showed them, and the ravine became a school, not of books, not of talk, but of survival. Annie taught the women how to spot dry moss even after rain, how to mix bark and clay for better sealant, how to tell good snow from bad, snow that melted fast versus snow that ate through stone. She showed the boys how to build an earth shelf to store food off the ground, how to turn broken axe handles into trenching tools, how to test the slope of a wall by dripping water down it. Even the old man, watched her with the quiet reverence men usually reserved for preachers and blacksmiths. They didn't see her as cursed anymore. They saw her as something harder to name. By mid-April, the snow in the valley was gone. Only the ridgelines held white now, and even those faded fast under the sun's new weight. Creeks swelled, grass pushed up through black soil. The first bees buzzed low over the ravine. That's when the town came back, not all at once. First it was a man on horseback, dressed too clean for someone who'd lived through the winter. Then two others, one with a satchel, one with a ledger book. They stood at the top of the ravine, not daring to come down. Annie watched them from below, her child swaddled on her back, soot on her cheek, hands still damp from sealing the newest wall. "Ma'am," the lead man called down. "We represent the township council." She said nothing. "We came to offer recognition. What you did here, saving those lives, sheltering families. There's talk of naming this area after you." Still, she said nothing. "We'd like to build something official, maybe a monument, and perhaps we can move you to the town proper. A home of your own, with support." She turned her head slightly. "I had a home," she said. "You burned it." One of the men cleared his throat. "That was an unfortunate incident, but you've proven yourself. The town knows now. You're not a—" He stopped, chose his words carefully. "You're not what they said." She looked back toward her shelter, smoke curling from the chimney, children's voices echoing faintly inside. The clay-packed walls still solid, the vent stones humming with the slow breath of the earth. "I'm exactly what they said," she replied, and she turned away. The men did not follow. That night, someone placed a wooden sign at the edge of the ravine. Rough-carved letters, uneven, painted dark. Shelter, nothing else. No name, no date, just that one word. But she tore it down, because this place was not a shrine, not a symbol, not something to be gazed upon by passing men in boots with clean hands and city eyes. This place was hers, and it had no name, not yet. Later that month, a family came down the ravine trail dragging a broken wagon and two children too thin for the season. Annie didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside, let them in, handed them a stone to sit on, pointed to the spot near the vent where the heat came strongest. They didn't speak for an hour. Then the father murmured, "Is it true? You built all this with your hands?" She said, "No." He looked confused. She nodded toward her child. "I built it with my reason." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. By May, she had dug 3 new side chambers into the rock. One for sleeping, one for food, and one she simply called the dark room. No one entered it but her. Inside, she kept her locket, a burnt scrap of wood from her old porch, and the last shirt her husband ever wore. Not for memory, not for mourning, for reminding, because she would not forget. Not what the cold did, not what the people did, and not what she became to survive it. She carved a shelf in the stone wall one day, and placed the latch from her cabin door there. Right above it, she etched a single line with the tip of a hunting knife. They took the roof, I took the ground, and she slept well that night. Not warm, not soft, but sure. The shelter continued to breathe, and so did she. Summer crept in without ceremony, not with birdsong or wildflowers or any kind of warmth that felt joyful. It came hard and uneven, the kind of summer that reminded you the mountains had never made promises, only demands. The sun dried the mud into cracking scars along the ravine walls. Rain slid off like it wasn't wanted, and the wind, when it came, still carried the scent of ash and pine rot. But the shelter held. The stones Annie laid in frost now warmed in the sun. The moss on the roof had taken root again, green and stubborn. Vents carried cool air now. The stove, long dormant, stood silent and watchful in its clay nest, as if waiting for the freeze to return. And Annie worked still, not out of fear, but because her hands had forgotten what stillness felt like. She dug a channel toward the stream. It took 3 weeks, all by hand, cutting through shale and dry clay, twisting around roots like black rope. She shaped it to slope just enough to bring water to the edge of her shelter without flooding it. When it ran true, clear and cold, she sat beside it barefoot and let her child splash in the slow current while the others looked on in quiet wonder. A boy asked her why she did it. She said, "Because thirst doesn't wait for winter." More families came, not in panic now, not dragging frostbitten children or carrying bundles of the dead. They came in silence, humbly, asking only if they could see what she had built. Many didn't ask to stay. They just wanted to know it was real. A woman came alone one morning, barefoot, with a scar across her cheek and a bundle of herbs slung over her shoulder. She never gave a name, just asked if there was room to tend to a few roots in the upper slope where the sun caught more than it used to. Annie nodded, and soon a garden began to rise, not in neat rows, but in shallow terraces, curved and uneven, following the shape of the earth. They grew potatoes, wild onion, and something that might have been cabbage once, tough and curled but edible. The children named it stone leaf. They ate it with pride, and Annie watched them grow. She didn't keep records. She didn't draw maps or write down her designs. But by July, there were 13 people sleeping in the shelter, and twice as many who came daily to learn. She taught without talking much, by motion, gesture, rhythm. She believed in sweat more than speech, and so they watched how she laid each stone, how she tested each beam, how she listened before she dug. One morning, a young man from the town brought a wagon of bricks. "Real ones," he said sheepishly. "From the old mill. Thought maybe you could use 'em." She stared at him a long time, then said, "I don't build with straight things." He looked confused. She pointed to the shelter. "Nothing here is straight. The ground curves. The wind turns, the snow slides, straight breaks." He took the bricks back, but 2 days later he returned with a load of clay and river sand, and stayed to help pack a new vent. By the time August rolled in, the town had stopped pretending she didn't exist. They came with offers, money, land, even a place on the council. She refused all of it, not out of spite, not because she hated them. She had no hate left, only truth. She had survived what they could not, and they would never understand what that took. One day, a group of women came with baskets of gifts, preserved jams, quilts, a sewing kit with brass scissors, a set of candles made from real wax. They stood awkwardly at the ravine's edge while Annie hoed soil near the slope garden. "We thought you might need things," one woman said, eyes on the dirt. Annie didn't stop working. After a long moment, she said, "Leave the scissors." They did, and left in silence. She used them later to cut her child's hair. By September, the shelter had 2 new chambers. One was a smoke room for meat. The other held rows of fire-dried herbs and roots, labeled with simple symbols etched into stone: fever leaf, bitter root, moss ash. A boy with a limp helped her organize them. He said he wanted to be a doctor one day. Annie didn't laugh. She simply gave him the sharpest knife and told him to keep his fingers out of the cut. They cured 5 fevers that fall. When the first frost came, earlier than usual, hard and fast, Annie was already ready. Stones were heated, beds moved closer to the inner wall, smoke holes sealed, and the stove, silent all summer, woke like an old god taking breath again. The wind howled one night, just one. The children slept through it. In the morning, frost clung to the upper trees, but not a single flake touched the shelter's mouth. That night they had a fire, not for warmth, for remembering. The old man who had lost 2 fingers in the freeze stood up. He had barely spoken since winter. Now his voice carried through the clay-walled chamber like something carved from oak. "She saved us," he said, eyes on Annie. "We called her cursed. We left her to die. We took her home and gave her smoke in return. And still she opened her door, not once, but every time. No one spoke. Then a child, the smallest among them, pointed toward Annie's child, now walking, eyes bright with curiosity. She built it for her. Annie didn't correct him. Because it was true. This wasn't a monument. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't proof. It was a womb carved in stone and clay, where a child could grow without fear of fire or freeze, where truth was measured in heat retained and lives kept breathing. In October, the first snow fell, soft, gentle, as if testing her. It melted before it reached the vent. One day, a stranger came through, grimy, boots worn, carrying stories from other towns. He said word of her shelter had traveled across 3 valleys, that people were talking about the woman who made a home in the earth. He asked if she would let him write about it. Annie didn't answer. He came back 2 days later with parchment and ink and asked again. She pointed to the locket above the stove. "Write about that," she said, "but not about me." He opened it, saw the sketch of her old cabin, a roof now turned to ash, and he understood. By late fall, others had built their own shelters, not in the ravine, but near it, not as good, not as warm, but inspired by it. A whole ring of dugouts and earth nests began to appear along the valley's southern ridge. They called the place Shelter's Bend, but Annie never used the name. To her, it was still just ground, earth that hadn't forgotten her, earth that breathed. She spent most of November gathering roots, not because she needed them, but because it kept her hands moving. When the sky turned slate gray and the trees went black with frost, she packed extra firewood near the main vent and carved another phrase above the stove. When fire took the roof, I found the sky underground. No one asked what it meant. They just read it and nodded. The baby, no longer a baby, spoke her first full sentence that winter. "Warm here, Mama." Annie held her close, pressed her ear to the girl's back, heard breath, steady, alive. That night, wind raged up high, but in the ravine it only whispered, and in the shelter, no longer a secret, no longer cursed, the breath of the earth rose steady through the vents, wrapping every stone and every soul in something deeper than warmth. It was a place built not to be seen, only to be survived, and that was enough.